Attention. In the next few minutes, you will discover why the world's largest technology company, valued at approximately $3.4 trillion in September 2025 according to Bloomberg, found out it cannot simply walk away from China and how this dependence puts its future at risk. Welcome to Telnomics, where we connect numbers to power, industry to geopolitics, and give you a clear map of what lies ahead. Apple is not just a giant in market value, it is a force capable of reshaping global supply chains. Yet, at the same time, its reliance on China exposes a fragility that could come at a heavy price. To understand the scale of this trap, one only needs to recall the episode of the so-called iPhone City in Zhengzhou. In January 2023, the outlet Rest of World revealed how strikes and stoppages at the Foxconn plant, which employs hundreds of thousands of workers, disrupted global iPhone production, exposing Apple's vulnerability in relying so heavily on Chinese territory. This was not an isolated accident, but a signal that efficiency can very quickly transform into dependence. When China joined the World Trade Organization in the early 2000s, the Western promise was clear. More trade would lead to more political openness. Yet by January 2023, the Financial Times reported that reality unfolded quite differently. Apple had invested billions of dollars to develop local suppliers and build a highly sophisticated production chain, but that infrastructure turned into a golden cage. Instead of liberalization, Beijing tightened control, ensuring that any foreign company, no matter how powerful, remained dependent on its network of factories and engineers. And what happens when the most innovative company in the United States ends up, often without realizing it, strengthening the industrial capacity of its greatest geopolitical rival? In April 2025, another Financial Times report highlighted that China's local technology champions, the so-called red suppliers, had grown strong enough to compete head-to-head with foreign giants. This was a direct result of years of knowledge transfer through Apple's partnerships. Then, in May 2025, Rest of World emphasized that even with Apple's attempts to expand into India, its structural dependence on China remained enormous and could not be undone overnight. The question becomes inevitable. When efficiency turns into dependence, who really controls whom? Apple, once appearing to have the world in its hands, must now face the unsettling possibility that it has not only built its own empire, but also fueled China's rise. And what if the truth is that Apple didn't just grow inside China, but actively helped build modern China itself? Consider this. The narrative we've always heard, that China provided Apple with the conditions to become a global giant, might be incomplete. Patrick McGee, author of Apple in China, published in 2023 and cited by the New York Times as one of that year's bestsellers, argues the exact opposite. He contends that it was Apple that helped construct modern China. Since 2008, the company trained more than 30 million workers across different levels of the supply chain, according to figures McGee shared in interviews with the Financial Times. That means Apple operated on a scale comparable to national universities, functioning as a school of practical engineering that shaped entire generations to meet its standard of perfection. Now think about the scale of this impact. In Zhengzhou, the so-called iPhone City, just one plant employed more than 400,000 workers dedicated to a single product, according to Rest of World in January 2023. This level of concentration is so massive that it resembles a national construction project more than a private business operation. We are talking about a single industrial complex employing more people than entire mid-sized American cities. Is this mere coincidence, or was it a deliberate strategy by the Chinese Communist Party to keep Apple deeply rooted within its borders? The paradox becomes even clearer when we recall that in 2017, Tim Cook, then Apple's CEO, publicly stated that the company was not in China because of cheap labor, but because of the abundance of skilled engineers. A statement recorded by the Financial Times. What he did not mention was that a large part of those engineers only existed because Apple had trained them in the first place. In other words, his statement contained a kernel of truth, but omitted the crucial detail. Apple had been the teacher. And here arises a fascinating micro-conflict. If the company built the army of engineers that now sustains China's industrial power, has it not become a prisoner of its own creation? When Apple attempts to diversify production to countries like India or Vietnam, it discovers that replicating 20 years of training, infrastructure, and a culture of precision cannot be achieved overnight. This raises the question we are about to explore further. To what extent can Apple still shape its own destiny? Or has it already handed over the keys to its independence to Beijing? The journey that led Apple to the heart of China began during a fragile moment. In the mid-1990s, the company was on the verge of bankruptcy. It was in this context that Steve Jobs returned, bringing not only a renewed vision for design, but also the conviction that the very way of producing technology needed reinvention. His obsession with perfection, whether in the color of internal cables or the finish on the back of a computer, details that the average consumer would never see, could not be met by traditional suppliers. A new ecosystem had to be created. That ecosystem emerged in China through a process that unfolded between 1996 and 2003, as detailed in Patrick McGee's book Apple in China, 2023. While other companies were chasing cost reductions, Apple was pursuing absolute quality. This required intensive training and strict control at every stage, transforming its partnership with Chinese suppliers into something closer to a national skills program. According to the Financial Times in January 2023, this policy helped China climb the technological ladder at record speed. The next leap was explosive. With the launch of the iPhone in 2007, global production jumped from 5 million units per year to more than 230 million in less than a decade, as documented by Statista in 2024. No other product had ever scaled so fast in both volume and influence. This expansion was only possible because Apple's China-built infrastructure was already prepared to respond with almost military precision to every new demand. Yet this very capacity turned dependence into a bottleneck. Without China, there was simply no way to sustain such scale. And here lies the inevitable question. Would the genius of Steve Jobs and his team have turned into global dominance without China's production machine? Or was it Apple itself that gave China the push to become an industrial power without precedent? This is not just a historical debate. It defines the strategic dilemma that continues to shape Apple's future today. If Steve Jobs' vision was essential to creating iconic products, Tim Cook's presence was decisive in transforming Apple into a logistical powerhouse. In 1998, Cook left Compaq, then the world's leading PC maker, to take on the challenge of reorganizing a company on the brink of collapse. The decision seemed irrational, but as Cook explained in a 2014 interview with Charlie Rose, it was driven almost by instinct. He believed Apple possessed something no other company had, the ability to combine innovation with large-scale efficiency. The numbers confirm the impact. Under his leadership, Apple's market value rose from $350 billion in 2011, the year of Steve Jobs' death, to over $3 trillion by 2025, according to Bloomberg. This represented not just the growth of a brand, but the creation of a global production system that operated like clockwork. Cook forged a vital partnership with Terry Gou, founder of Foxconn, which built the backbone of factories in China. This arrangement allowed Apple to become the largest electronics manufacturer in the world, without owning a single factory itself. But dependence on this structure soon revealed its darker side. In January 2023, Rest of World reported that Zhengzhou, known as iPhone City, employed over 400,000 workers in a single complex. When protests and walkouts erupted there, global production came to a standstill. The episode exposed a strategic fragility. Apple had outsourced not only its labor force but also part of its own destiny. The micro-conflict is clear. The genius of Jobs and the discipline of Cook built a near-perfect machine, but perhaps one too perfect to remain flexible. If Apple's power rests on a production chain concentrated in Chinese territory, how can it respond when that very territory decides to impose barriers and restrictions? This is where the story crosses into geopolitics and forces us to ask an unsettling question. Is the world's most valuable company truly prepared for a future where efficiency and sovereignty collide head-on? The geopolitical turning point that shaped this scenario took place in 2001, when China entered the World Trade Organization. The Western expectation was clear. As China grew wealthier, it would inevitably open its doors to democratic capitalism. Yet, as the Financial Times analyzed in January 2023, the opposite happened. The Chinese Communist Party used integration to tighten control, turning foreign companies into strategic pieces on a larger chessboard. Apple was one of the engines of this process. According to the Wall Street Journal in December 2022, more than 90% of iPhones were still produced in China, even after years of attempts to diversify. This demonstrates that dependence was not circumstantial, but structural. Beijing understood early on that the scale and complexity of Apple's products would function as a natural barrier preventing the company from leaving. The consequences often bordered on surreal. Between 2014 and 2016, Apple pressured American Airlines to create direct routes to Chinese cities such as Chengdu and Hangzhou, guaranteeing profitability by buying enough seats to keep flights viable, even when nearly empty. This was reported by United Airlines and later covered by Bloomberg in 2017. What looked like efficient logistics was, in reality, proof of how deeply symbiotic the relationship had become. Apple was reshaping global infrastructure just to sustain its dependence. And here lies the paradox. While Apple benefited enormously from this relationship, it also fueled China's transformation into a technological power. The micro-conflict emerges when we realize that the logic of globalization, supposedly meant to make everyone more open and interdependent, turned into a trap. The unavoidable question is, who truly gained more from this partnership, Apple or China? The answer could redefine not only the company's future, but also the balance of global power itself. The behind-the-scenes of this relationship reveal details that resemble a corporate espionage plot more than simple business strategies. In Zhengzhou, the so-called iPhone City, a single complex employed more than 400,000 workers, according to Rest of World in January 2023. That figure exceeds the population of many mid-sized American cities and illustrates just how deeply Apple became embedded in what was essentially a Chinese national construction effort. With every new production line, it was not only the company that grew, but also China's capacity to dictate the course of the global tech industry. Other stories reinforce this almost unbelievable scale. Between 2014 and 2016, Apple pushed United Airlines to establish direct flights from San Francisco to Chinese cities like Chengdu and Hangzhou. To keep those routes profitable, the company purchased dozens of first-class seats, as reported by Bloomberg in 2017. In practice, these flights functioned as a private air bridge for Apple engineers, showing how far the company was willing to go to shape infrastructure well outside its own sector in order to keep its production machine running. These examples show that Apple did not merely operate in China. It orbited around it. The micro-conflict is evident. The more the company expanded, the deeper its dependence became. Each iPhone produced was not just a consumer product, but another link in a chain binding Apple to the strategy of the Chinese Communist Party. And the inevitable question arises, how much of this scale truly belongs to Apple, and how much has already been absorbed by China? If the world's most valuable company needs to negotiate airline routes just to sustain production, what does that say about its real autonomy? The answer may be more uncomfortable than most are willing to admit. Today, Apple's dilemma is unavoidable. How can it maintain its dominant position in a world where dependence and sovereignty have become two sides of the same coin? The company that once symbolized the pinnacle of innovation is now facing pressures that go far beyond the consumer market. In April 2025, the Financial Times revealed that Chinese suppliers, the so-called red champions, had grown strong enough to rival foreign giants precisely because of decades of knowledge transfer facilitated by Apple. And in May 2025, Rest of World reported that despite Apple's efforts to shift some production to India, more than 80% of iPhone assembly was still locked inside Chinese territory. This reality exposes a deep contradiction. While Apple seeks to project itself as a defender of privacy and individual freedom in its global messaging, behind the scenes it depends on an industrial structure tightly controlled by a regime that imposes large-scale surveillance and restricts fundamental rights. How can this carefully crafted public image be reconciled with the reality of factories in Zhengzhou, where, according to the New York Times in November 2022, worker protests over conditions were met with harsh crackdowns? The sense is that Apple has reached a point of no return. On one hand, it must preserve the profit margins and production scale that only China can provide. On the other, it faces mounting political, social, and investor pressure to diversify and achieve greater strategic independence. The micro-conflict is stark. The more the company pursues autonomy, the more it collides with the impossibility of replicating in other countries the ecosystem of millions of engineers and hundreds of factories it helped to build in China. And here comes the final reflection. What happens when Apple's very foundation for growth turns into its greatest threat? Are we witnessing the beginning of the decline of the world's most valuable company? Or simply the start of a new cycle in which Apple will be forced to reinvent not only its products, but its entire production chain? Answering this question requires looking both at Apple's immediate future and the geopolitical board on which it plays. The company is still worth about $3 trillion as of September 2025, according to Bloomberg, but it faces risks that do not appear in its quarterly earnings reports. The rise of artificial intelligence, led by companies like Microsoft, OpenAI, and NVIDIA, pressures Apple to prove it can still set the pace of technological innovation. Meanwhile, Beijing has made its stance clear. In 2023, Xi Jinping declared through Xinhua that China will never deindustrialize, signaling the government's unwillingness to allow the mass exit of companies that fuel its productive strength. This is not just a theoretical standoff. In November 2022, the New York Times reported that Chinese authorities restricted the movement of Apple engineers and equipment when the company considered expanding operations outside China. This made clear who truly controls the gears of production. And in July 2024, Reuters revealed that Apple's attempts to move production to India were delayed due to the lack of local suppliers able to meet the company's standards of precision, reinforcing the trap of dependence. The big question now is whether Apple can break this cycle. Diversifying production does not mean simply opening new factories. It requires replicating 2 decades of training, infrastructure, and a culture of precision engineering that Apple itself helped to foster in China. It is a costly, slow, and risky process. Will investors, long accustomed to record profit margins, have the patience for such a transition? Or will Apple continue to accept the risk of keeping the heart of its production in a country whose government openly uses economic power as a political weapon? And so we reach the climax of this narrative. Apple, a company long celebrated for controlling every detail of its products, is now confronted with the harsh reality of not controlling its own future. The next move may determine whether it remains the world's most powerful tech empire or enters an inevitable cycle of decline. Apple's fate is no longer decided solely in Cupertino. It increasingly lies in Beijing's hands. The riddle that remains is simple, yet devastating. Does Apple still have the power of choice, or has it already lost control of its own story? On one hand, it prides itself on being the ultimate symbol of American innovation. On the other, it is trapped in a mechanism that strengthens the rise of its greatest geopolitical competitor. The Wall Street Journal reported in December 2022 that more than 90% of iPhone production remained concentrated in China, despite years of promises about diversification. This numerical reality proves that structural dependence cannot be undone quickly. Alternatives do exist, but they are fragile. In July 2024, Reuters revealed that Apple's attempt to shift part of its production to India faced severe challenges due to the lack of prepared suppliers. Meanwhile, factories in Vietnam were established, but at such a small scale that they cannot compete with Zhengzhou's mega-complexes. At the same time, China's so-called national champions, empowered by decades of working alongside Apple, are now competing globally with firms like Xiaomi and Huawei, reinforcing the argument that Apple not only helped China rise, but also nurtured its direct competitors. Given this reality, the public must ask, are we witnessing the start of the decline of the world's largest tech company, or simply the birth of a new era where Apple must reinvent not just its products, but also its supply chain and political strategy? The answer will not be found in glamorous product launches, but in the quiet negotiations between Cupertino and Beijing, where each decision could redefine the balance of global power. And here is the invitation. If you want to keep following how this story unfolds, subscribe to Telnomics, leave your comment, and share your opinion. Apple's fate is a reflection of the world we live in, and understanding this transformation may be the key to grasping the future of both technology and geopolitics. Thank you for being with us, and prepare yourself, because the next chapters promise to be even more surprising.